r/NoSleep. Posted by u/BasedGod3001. We went looking for a strange man in our cemetery. When I was a freshman in high school, I spent almost every lunch break at the St. Clair's Cemetery a few minutes from the school grounds. Me and two of my friends would walk down there each day, winding around the trails and talking. We appreciated the peace and quiet that came with this place, as it was almost always devoid of people. When we visited the cemetery, we entered through a large metal gate from the sidewalk. The path wound around the entire property, leading around the plots, down a steep hill and back to the gates. This place was full of headstones belonging to all kinds of the deceased, young, old, rich, poor, and especially dead soldiers. Every time we passed through, we walked by a whole section filled with white crosses, some of them bearing Canadian flags. Just past the war heroes was a fork in the path, leading back towards the edge of the cemetery, next to the road, and a path through the middle of the graveyard. Usually we just walked through the middle of the property, headed back down the hill and out through the gates again. Overlooking the whole area was St. Clair's Church, which was just some standard fare Catholic church with a defunct electronic sign out front. So every day we would set out in our light jackets, or just t-shirts, laughing and talking and walking. It was just me and my friends Lloyd and Daniel. Lloyd was a deceptively athletic kid who could run fast and far. He looked skinny, but he got himself on every sports team he could. He was the most argumentative of us, constantly challenging and prodding and jokingly insulting. There was no winning an argument with him, but for some reason I would always try. Daniel was meek, quiet and pretty smart. When he talked, he knew what he was talking about, but he rarely challenged anyone or spoke his mind. I liked talking to him the most, because he liked to avoid conflict. He liked to get along. But we all enjoyed each other's company, at least enough to band together each day, so we walked. From the very beginning of that fall, we spent the hour talking about whatever nonsense we were into, and pointing out funny names on headstones. On one October day, with a blanket of clouds tucked over the sky, I sat out there with just my dog. I walked through those big metal gates, mud and tow, and I began walking the path in silence. I made it all but 20 feet before that silence was broken by a man standing by the curb next to the paved path. I had not noticed him until he spoke, so I was startled, and he seemed to smile at that. "What do you think, huh?" He grinned, leaning on someone's resting place. "What?" I asked softly, not fully enunciating the word. "About God. Do you think this is his plan?" I was standing there, stopped in my tracks, wondering what the man in the red flannel was going on about. "Oh, I don't know. What do you mean?" "This kid here." He patted the gravestone he had been supporting himself with. "He's 16 years old or was." He corrected himself. "Oh yeah." I dumbfoundedly forced out. "All around here, I mean. It's just 4-year-olds and 8-year-olds and teenagers, like you." "Yeah, that's too bad," I said in an attempt to actually add to the conversation. "Yeah, you get it. You know. You understand all this bullshit, don't you? You're not one of them, huh?" I nervously smiled and started walking again, giving him a little nod as I passed. "You have a good walk now," he called as I walked a little faster down the path. I went through the usual route, only this time I was a little freaked out by my encounter. He didn't really do anything too alarming, but talking about dead kids in an empty graveyard was a bizarre thing to do. As I made my way through the place, I noticed him meandering through the surrounding plots. He seemed to be checking out the graves, looking at the gifts people had left and reading names. I walked through the middle path, glancing over at him, but he didn't seem to be paying any attention to me. By the time I reached the final stretch leading to the gate, I felt a sense of relief. He seemed pretty harmless, but it was still unsettling to be alone in a cemetery with him. When I got home, which was only a few minutes away, I asked my dad if he had ever seen a weird guy hanging around St. Clair's. Keep in mind that my dad often walked the dog there as well, sometimes with me and sometimes alone. The only reason for this is that we lived in a very boring urban center, and St. Clair's Cemetery is one of the only quiet, empty places nearby. He said that he hadn't seen anything, but he immediately followed up with a question. He asked me what exactly I had seen. I told him about the interaction, saying that it was awkward and strange. He reminded me of the vandalism that had been going on in that area. Someone had smashed up multiple headstones, probably with a sledgehammer, damaging them significantly. He said that if anything, that guy could have been the vandal. I had previously known about the vandalism, but it hadn't crossed my mind until he brought it up. Now, considering myself some sort of fledgling investigator, I went to my room and searched up St. Clair vandalism. I found nothing about damaged headstones, but I found something else entirely. Suspect in St. Clair Evangelical Church fire arrested. Pictured in this article was a tall bald man, looking up at a security camera. Apparently, this guy had set a minor fire in the church, causing some damage to property inside the building. There was no major structural damage, and the place was entirely empty. He had committed this crime in the dead of night, when there was nobody to witness the arson. However, a security camera caught him very clearly, and he was promptly arrested in the days following the fire. This had happened 4 years before I found the article, so it was safe to assume he was a free man at the time. He had only caused a few $1,000s worth of damage, and his problem seemed entirely mental. The Canadian justice system got him psychiatric help, fined him and spat him out onto the street. I studied the picture of the suspect. I didn't get the best look at the graveyard guy, but I knew he was bald, just like the suspect. He seemed shorter in person, and significantly older than the picture, but I couldn't be sure either way. I didn't really know if it was the same guy, but I was desperately hoping it was. This would add such rich folklore to the cemetery, and it would be fun to tell the guys about it. Watch out at St. Clair's, there's a psycho on the loose, vandalizing the place and setting fires left and right. The next day, at lunch, I elected to stay inside with Daniel and Lloyd, going instead to the library. I told them about my encounter, telling them that it was probably this arsonist who set fire to the church, and that he was rambling on about God and dead kids. I showed them the picture of the suspect, whose name was Francis Lavoie. By the way, terrifying, I know. Searching his full name, which was French-sounding, we found a video on some third-rate video-sharing platform. Other results included 1 or 2 articles about the fire, a Francis Lavoie Facebook page and some irrelevant nonsense. The video looked like an original upload by the man, made in the summer of 2012. It was almost 40 minutes long. The Gospel according to Francis. So we watched it, and it was actually pretty boring. It opened up with some foreign-sounding music, an iMovie-esque title card and some narration over stock images. There's a story about a man, looking out into the world, watching all the corruption, pain and suffering of his fellow man. He looks to the heavens, and he asks God, "Why don't you do anything?" God looked down at the man and answered, "I did do something. I made you." Francis went on to talk about his experiences traveling the world, how he has interacted with every culture, and his journey as a man. He frequently mentioned how the Catholic Church brainwashes its members, including him as a child, and how they prevent people from achieving free will. He seemed bitter about religion being imposed on him as a child, but he presented his case in a calm way. Obviously, we were bored to tears by all the talk about churches and answering the questions of the universe and so on. We watched a few minutes, paused it and immediately started talking about what this guy must be up to. Lloyd posited that he must be out for more revenge against this church, desecrating graves and patrolling the grounds. I played along with this idea because it was fun. Daniel shrugged and occasionally added something, but he seemed to think we were exaggerating the reality of the situation. Which we probably were. But we had fun with it. The next day, we were walking through the cemetery again, looking around for signs of Francis, or whoever I had ran into. We found nothing that day, but we remained vigilant, hoping something would happen. We kept coming back, poking around the cemetery, looking at damaged gravestones and peering into the church. I guess we fancied ourselves a poor man's Hardy Boys, looking for Francis the arsonist on the grounds of St. Clair's. One day, we sat on the grass just under the top of the hill by the church, talking and relaxing. We were having a good time, just laughing and enjoying the late October weather in our jackets, until something crept up behind us. That something was a black Jeep, which was moving just slow enough to make almost no noise, save for the gentle crackling of pebbles and worn pavement against the tires. My stomach, and I assume all of our stomachs, dropped into the abyss the moment we realized there was a Jeep creeping up over the hill. My heart began pounding out of my chest, and we all rose from our seats on the grass. Without a word, we all began booking it down the steep hill, our legs making incredibly long strides, as if we were flying down the incline. The Jeep continued to creep down the hill, but we occupied the grass, as we didn't want to be in its path. I was afraid I might stumble and fall, or trip on something, as I was a little clumsy. Luckily, I remained on my feet, and adrenaline carried me all the way to the bottom of the hill. Lloyd was way ahead of me, and he had taken the lead, running in a straight path to a fence. Up the path to our right was the gate, but Lloyd decided to take the express route to the sidewalk over the fence. Daniel followed him, and so did I. Lloyd was over the fence in a flash. and Daniel didn't take much longer. By the time they were on the other side, the Jeep had sidled up along the path, directly in line with us. It was probably 40 feet away, and it just sat there as I started to climb the fence. I anticipated the sound of a door opening, of screaming, of menacing threats and gnashing teeth. I stepped on a root, pushing myself up and swinging my body on top of the fence. I looked over at the Jeep, seeing the man inside just staring in my direction. As my heart beat in my throat, I tried to swing my other leg over the fence, to freedom. To my blood-chilling horror, a moment later, I was still not on the other side. Instead, I had gotten my jeans caught on an especially sharp, pokey piece of chain-link fence that jutted out from the top. I tried to thread the fabric over the metal, hopefully freeing myself, but I couldn't do it fast enough. Fuck. Help me get off this shit. I pleaded. My heartbeat continued to assault my ribcage, and it felt like my blood was pumping at an impossible rate. As I began ripping my jeans, trying to tear them away from the clutches of the fence, I heard the driver bang on the outside of the door loudly, as if warning me. I continued ripping, ruining my pants and trying not to cry out of frustration. The metal dug into my leg, causing a stinging pain and making it harder to free myself. Then, my worst fears came true. I heard the door open. I refused to look, instead focusing entirely on not dying in a cemetery. Daniel grabbed me, pulling me to the other side with a loud epic that did a number on my jeans. Bloody leg, ripped jeans and all, I ran with Daniel and Lloyd back to school, to safety. When we finally sat down, panting and gasping for air, trying to reset our heart rates, we all knew one thing. We were not done with the graveyard guy. For the next few days, all we could talk about was our narrow escape from the St. Clair stalker. We built our own little folklore around him, who we had now decided was definitely Francis Lavoie, and we speculated on what he might be doing. Lloyd said that he had probably been watching us each day we visited the cemetery. I entertained this idea, but Daniel mostly stayed out of it. He said that if it really was the arsonist, he was probably unhinged and meddling with him would be unwise. However, he told me it probably wasn't Francis, and that it could have just been a groundskeeper. The weekend came and went, and it was almost Halloween. We had planned on visiting St. Clair after school that Monday, so we could look around and determine the facts. I wasn't sure what we were really expecting, but it was mostly just a way of messing around and hyping up the narrative we had created. I walked down the hill from my house to the cemetery that day, which was the 29th of the month. My house was a few blocks from the school, and it sat at the top of a hill that led down towards the graveyard. I left around 6 o'clock, and the evening was creeping up on me slowly but surely. Once again, clouds smothered the sky above me, and the weather was just cold enough to force me into a jacket. My friends were waiting for me by the gate. Along the beginning of the path, bare trees hung over our heads as we trekked into our stomping grounds. Lloyd flashed a smile at us as we entered, pulling a small object from his pocket. "Don't be afraid, I brought my knife," he said, semi-sarcastically. I scoffed, sort of amused. "What are you gonna do? If someone pops out at us, are you going to actually, physically stab them?" Lloyd shrugged and slid it back into his pocket. "Maybe." "I don't think that's legal in Canada, dude," interjected Daniel as his eyes locked onto the path in front of him. "Well, neither is stalking. Or whatever else Francis gets up to," Lloyd reasoned. We trudged up the hill, examining cracked headstones and the flowers laid in front of them. At one point, I saw a coyote slip between the graves, prowling for some neighborhood cat, or squirrel, or whatever they ate. Turning to the center of the graveyard, we made our way down the path, deeper into the heart of the grim property, occasionally ducking under hanging tree branches. At some point we stopped, near the back of the cemetery, where a fence closed us off from a parking lot. Maybe 300 feet to our left was the building nobody knew the purpose of, maybe it was a shed or small garage, and a black Jeep. The black Jeep. Oh, boy. We kept our eyes on it, all excitedly watching the familiar vehicle as it sat outside of the small structure. We hung around for a few more minutes, waiting from a comfortable distance for something to happen. And then it did. The door to the structure swung open, and we all watched as the man stepped out holding a toolbox. We were both giddy and nervous, honestly surprised that he was here at all. As we shushed each other, we watched him walk over to the Jeep, open the door and just stand there. "We should go," said Daniel, a little too loud. The man slowly turned his head, spotting us immediately as we stood in the middle of the path. He turned his entire body to us and waved both arms, shouting something that I didn't fully understand. What I could easily tell, though, was that he wanted to know what the hell we were doing out there. Lloyd, feeling cocky in our little group, promptly stuck his middle finger up at him, holding it in the air defiantly. I told him to chill out, as that might not be a good idea, but he seemed not to care. The man quickly returned the gesture, and he appeared incredibly angry. I could tell he was raging just by the way he moved, which was stiff, jerky and tense. A moment later, he clearly yelled "fucking assholes," and turned around to face the open car door. "Yo, let's go. Stop fucking around," I told Lloyd. Daniel clearly agreed. The man reached into the car, pulling out what was probably a wrench, and began walking in our direction. Lloyd flashed his knife, actually laughing as he did, still not taking it as seriously as Daniel and I were. We started running in the direction of the gate as Lloyd yelled something at the man. A few seconds later, I heard Lloyd running right behind us, shoes pounding hard against the grass. "He's running. Holy shit," he yelled. That was enough to make me run even faster, although Lloyd passed me after about 20 seconds. I didn't look back as we tore through the cemetery, shoes slapping against grass and pavement, breathing heavily and praying that he was slow. By the time we reached the gate, we looked back and the man was nowhere to be seen. Then and there, I decided this was enough fear for a lifetime, and that I would stop going back to investigate this strange man. We all walked back towards my house, still panting and recovering. At that point, it had gotten dark. I told them I was done, but Lloyd shrugged off the severity of the situation. He said that the guy wasn't really chasing us, and that he was probably afraid of actually fighting us, so we weren't really in danger. I felt a little foolish for looking for him at all, and annoyed that Lloyd would be so flippant about it. As we neared the top of the hill, Lloyd flashed that smile again and brazenly asked me, "You want to go back?" I didn't. When I got home, Daniel and Lloyd went their separate ways, and I looked up Francis Lavoie again. I visited his Facebook page, which had nothing on it, aside from one post promoting the gospel according to Francis years ago. I didn't know if he was active at all, but I decided to reach out to him in case he was. "Was that you in St. Clair's?" If he answered, I would apologize for Lloyd fucking with him, which would set my mind at ease. It was a long shot, but oh well. I didn't like the idea of an ex-con holding a grudge against me, especially if he lived in the neighborhood, which seemed likely. I sat on my bed and breathed a sigh of relief. I was all right, and so were Daniel and Lloyd. In my pocket, my phone buzzed, making me jump a little. I looked at the notification. Lloyd had texted me. "Checking out the shed. We'll send pics." Jesus Christ. It was pretty dark by now, and he was opting to go back alone? I didn't understand the point, but sometimes Lloyd just did risky things to prove a point. A few minutes later, I got another text. "It's fine. Jeep is gone. No guy." He sent me a poorly lit image of the outside of the shed, and there was no Jeep there. I waited for the impending pictures of whatever was inside the shed, but they didn't come. By midnight, I just went to sleep, deciding that I would ask him about his experience in person. The next day, Daniel was at school, but Lloyd was not. We started getting pretty concerned, so we visited his house after school. His mom answered the door, and she was a wreck. No, she had not seen Lloyd, which intensified our fears that something had happened to him the previous night. We told her that he had gone to St. Clair's Cemetery, and that she should include that in a police report. That day, when I got home, I checked Facebook and was surprised to learn that Francis Lavoie had responded. "No? Who is this?" At that point, I fully realized that there was no way the man was Francis Lavoie. He was shorter, older and didn't really resemble him beyond having no hair. Whoever we had run into was a completely random person, likely a groundskeeper or something, like Daniel had said. I texted Daniel, asking him if he wanted to go check the shed area for signs of Lloyd. It was still possible that he had been playing a prank on us, trying to convince us that something bad had happened, only to show up at a later time. Memories of him ditching me in the cemetery at night in the summer flashed through my head. I was left there in the darkness, calling out for him before inevitably running home by myself. Lloyd wasn't above a mean-spirited joke. Since it was broad daylight, Daniel said he would come to look around for a bit. We probably should have just gone to the police, but Lloyd had fooled me too many times to immediately default to that. Daniel arrived at the gates, and we made our way down the path, past the war heroes, around the back of the property and up towards the shed. At first, nothing looked out of place. There was no Jeep, there were no people and everything was quiet. I walked up to the shed, but Daniel hung back. I knocked on the door, not really expecting an answer. I paused in front of the door, still nervous to go inside, just building up the nerve to do it. I took a step back and looked at Daniel, who shrugged. Another moment passed, and I finally reached for the doorknob. I slowly turned it, still listening closely for any sounds. And then I heard something. Somewhere inside there was a faint shuffling. I immediately recoiled, almost ready to run away, but I stopped. "Hello?" I called out to whatever was inside. I could hear my heartbeat as I waited for a response. A few seconds passed, and a muffled groan made its way to my ears. It sounded like someone waking up with a fever, weakly moaning in pain. "Lloyd?" asked Daniel. Then there was another groan. I opened the door and shined my phone's light inside, panning the weak light source across the small room. Directly in front of the door was a small metal chair, but the rest of the room was empty. I took a single step inside, and another groan startled me, as it came from my right. I shined the light towards the sound. There, in the corner of the shed, was Lloyd. Dried blood was matted in his hair, and he could barely hold his head up to look at me. "Holy shit, dude," was all I could say. I called the police, and paramedics came to lift him out of there. He had a severe head injury, and had some significant brain damage. If he had been left there much longer, he likely would have died in that dark shed. Lloyd would wake up in the hospital several days later, and within a week we understood the entire story. When he entered the shed that night, he was ambushed and left for dead. The police connected the black Jeep to another incident that night, which took place about half an hour from the cemetery. The Jeep was parked on the side of a busy road, and the driver threw himself in front of a passing truck. Inside the Jeep was a hard drive, stocked with pictures and videos of the church and the surrounding property. Pictures had been taken through the windows, license plates of nearby cars were captured and much more. Pictures of me, Daniel and Lloyd had been taken from various points in the cemetery as we walked around. These pictures were given file names like Agent_01, Agent_02 and so on. From the files found on the hard drive, it was pieced together that the man harbored conspiracy theories about the churches in our city, believing that they were stalking and harassing him. Francis Lavoie was a recovered psychiatric patient who had really set fire to a different church of a similar name, about an hour away from our St. Clair's. To this day, Lloyd has difficulty speaking due to the damage caused to his brain. He is still being treated for recurring seizures and memory loss.